Do you remember those forgotten ground beef recipes, the ones you could only find in old cookbooks and nowhere else? Back then, these dishes were the backbone of weeknight dinners, stretched to feed a family and written in pencil on stained recipe cards. What else have we quietly lost along with them? They were called porcupine meatballs because they looked exactly like that. Tiny ground beef meatballs with stiff little spikes of rice sticking out. Uncooked rice mixed right into the meat would expand while simmering in tomato sauce, giving it a look that was part dinner and part art project. You could find these in old spiral-bound cookbooks with a plastic comb spine, and maybe some notes written in pen along the edges. These meatballs were not about elegance, they were about getting a meal to stretch. The rice helped the beef go farther, the sauce gave it moisture, and kids thought it was fun to look at. Most of the time, the sauce was just canned tomato soup mixed with a little bit of onion or seasoning. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan cheese, just whatever you had. In homes where meat had to be portioned out carefully, porcupine meatballs were a bit of a magic trick. This was not something you would ever find in a restaurant, but every church cookbook in the country had a version. Cowboy pie was rough and hearty, ground beef, baked beans, and a biscuit topping that crisped up in the oven just enough to hold everything together. There were no cowboys involved, but it felt like something a hungry ranch hand would love. It was warm, it was messy, and it filled you right up. The base was usually ground beef cooked down with onions and sometimes a little barbecue sauce or ketchup, then a layer of baked beans, canned of course, and a topping of drop biscuits or biscuit dough from a box. When it came out of the oven, it was golden and bubbling and maybe a little lopsided. No one cared. It was dependable. You served it with a spoon straight from the pan and hoped there was enough left for seconds. The kind you made when the pantry was running low but dinner still had to happen. And somehow, it always hit the spot. The name alone made kids raise their eyebrows, but once they tasted it, they stopped asking. Upside-down beef casserole was ground beef and vegetables poured into a dish, topped with biscuit dough and baked until golden. Then came the fun part. You flipped it. Or at least tried to. Sometimes it held together, sometimes it did not. But the flavors were always there. The beef had onion, salt, maybe garlic powder if you had it. The vegetables were canned corn, peas, carrots, whatever needed using. The biscuit crust crisped on top and soaked up flavor underneath. It was a hot, messy miracle. This came from a time when housewives were told to make dinner an experience, and this counted. Flipping it added excitement when life had little of it. It was a clever way to turn old ingredients into something new. No rules. Leftovers? In they went. Cheese? Sprinkle it on. Dinner was supposed to be practical, but it could still surprise you. Shipwreck stew looked like a mess, which was the idea. It was all layered into one pot: ground beef, potatoes, rice, canned soup, and maybe a few carrots. No stirring. Just stack it and let it simmer. The name came from how it looked, but the flavor was comforting. It was hearty, tangy, and always filling. This was survival food, emotional or otherwise. No fancy steps. The soup worked as sauce and seasoning. The starches made the beef stretch. It fed a whole family and left some for tomorrow. There was beauty in the chaos. Each family had their version, passed down in notes and memory. Some added beans, others swapped pasta for rice, but all of them made it work. Shipwreck stew meant one thing: making do. And maybe that is why it felt so good. It filled the plate, the belly, and sometimes the quiet. Hamburger spoon bread bake was a southern trick that turned two humble meals into one. You seasoned ground beef, poured cornbread batter over it, and baked it until it puffed and browned. The meat stayed juicy, the cornbread caught the drippings, and every bite was soft and satisfying. You served it with a spoon, never sliced. That was the charm. It was food for people who had worked all day and just wanted something warm. It was often made with leftover cornbread or box mix, paired with beef fried with onions and maybe some paprika or chili powder. Cheese? Sometimes. Vegetables? If they were around. It depended on what was in the pantry and who was coming over. Spoon-bread bake was loved in small towns where casseroles mattered, and feeding more people with less was a way of life. It might not look like much, but it was as filling as a second helping of love. Before it made its comeback on social media, beef and tater tot hot dish was already a legend in Midwest kitchens. You browned your ground beef with onion, layered it in a casserole dish, topped it with a can of cream soup, mushroom, celery, chicken, and crowned it with frozen tater tots. Then you baked it until it bubbled. The tots crisped up, the meat stayed saucy, and the whole house smelled like a snow day with nothing else to do but eat. It was cheap, easy, and had everything: protein, carbs, salt, and memory. This dish was never about nutrition. It was about morale. It showed up at church dinners, weeknights, and holiday leftovers. It was a blank canvas, too. Add corn, peas, cheese, whatever needed using. The best versions were a little sloppy, with crisp edges and soft centers. The first scoop might burn your tongue, but no one waited. It was casserole as comfort, and it worked. A meal that made you forget the weather, the bills, and the stress, just for a minute. Mock Swiss steak with ground beef was not fooling anyone, but no one minded. The original called for a real steak pounded flat and simmered in tomato gravy. The ground beef version skipped all that and made a patty. You browned it in a skillet, poured canned tomatoes over it, added onions, and let it simmer. The result was part burger, part meatloaf. It was soft, it was salty, it was cheap and dependable. In homes where steak was not on the menu, this was how you pretended. People served it with mashed potatoes or egg noodles, maybe a slice of white bread for the gravy. A pound of ground beef could stretch far if you shaped it right. This recipe showed up in many cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s. It had different names: mock steak, gravy patties, poor man's steak, but the idea stayed. Make something that felt like more than it was. The kind of dinner that said, "This will do," and really meant it. Sloppy Joe pie was what you made when a sandwich was not quite enough. The sweet, tangy beef, made with ketchup, mustard, and maybe brown sugar, got spooned into a dish and topped with biscuit dough or pie crust. Then it baked until golden and bubbly. It smelled like school lunches and weekday nights. The filling was classic Sloppy Joe, but the crust gave it shape. You could eat it with a fork. You could add cheese. Some families topped it with cornbread or mashed potatoes instead. It was a recipe that adapted to whatever was in the kitchen. What never changed was how satisfying it felt. One pan, one meal, one good reason to sit down and eat. It was often made after a sandwich dinner when the meat outlasted the buns. Sloppy Joe pie made the most of what was left and still gave you something to look forward to. It was humble, but proud, made for people who did not ask for much, just something warm and maybe a little sweet. Beef and cottage cheese bake sounds like a weird combination today, but it was considered smart back then. The ground beef was browned and seasoned, then mixed with egg noodles, onions, and generous scoops of cottage cheese. Sometimes there was sour cream, sometimes there was tomato sauce, but it always ended up creamy, savory, and just the right kind of filling. It was especially good for households trying to add protein without buying more meat. Cottage cheese was cheap, and it lasted longer than you expected. This was a casserole that blended dairy and meat in a way that was not fancy but worked. It came out of the oven bubbling, with a top that browned slightly and a center that held together like lasagna without the effort. You could serve it straight from the pan, and it held heat like a dream. Some versions added peas or bell peppers for color, others stayed pure and beige and soft. Either way, it filled the belly and made people happy. In a time when families were cutting coupons and stretching paychecks, this was a dinner you could count on. Simple, practical, and more delicious than it had any right to be. Old-fashioned Johnny Marzetti was not just a dish, it was a whole era in one casserole. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomato sauce, and shredded cheese came together to make a meal that never failed to deliver. It started in Ohio, where a restaurant gave it a name, but soon it was all over the Midwest, printed in cookbooks and passed between families. It was made in big metal pans, usually on Sundays or when relatives came over. You browned the beef, stirred in the cooked macaroni, added the sauce, canned or homemade, whatever was available, and topped the whole thing with cheese. Then you baked it until the top browned and bubbled. It was a dish that could sit on a counter for an hour and still be good. It fed a crowd, reheated like a dream, and always reminded you of some aunt or grandma who made it best. Johnny Marzetti was cheap, filling, and dependable. It was also quietly brilliant. With 1 pound of meat and a box of pasta, you had dinner for days. Some people added olives or mushrooms, others kept it plain. What mattered was that it showed up, and it always did. Salisbury steak casserole was the homemade version of a frozen food legend. Instead of pulling a silver tray from the oven, families made their own from scratch, and honestly, it was usually better. This version called for seasoned ground beef shaped into thick oval patties, then baked in a mushroom and onion gravy. It was rich, saucy, and had that stick-to-your-ribs kind of feel. If you were lucky, someone would sprinkle crispy fried onions on top during the last few minutes in the oven, adding that perfect crunch to an already comforting dish. It was not a fancy meal, but it felt like something special. Some people added Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy for extra umami, but most just used canned soup and a good hand with salt and pepper. You would serve it with mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or a slice of white bread to sop up all that gravy. Kids loved it because it tasted like fast food. Adults loved it because it was hearty and cheap. Picnic meatloaf squares were a summer favorite long before pasta salad or grilled hot dogs took over the spotlight. You would make a basic meatloaf, ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasoning. Then chill it overnight, slice it into neat rectangles, and wrap them in wax paper like little parcels. They were meant to be eaten cold, straight from the cooler, with no heating, no mess, and no complaints. These squares were usually seasoned with dry onion soup mix, a heavy squirt of ketchup, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire sauce if someone was feeling bold. There was something kind of dignified about pulling one out during a picnic and eating it on a paper plate next to potato chips and lemonade. It was meatloaf without ceremony. They were practical, portable, and surprisingly tasty even without being warm. Some families packed them with pickles or thin slices of cheese on the side. Others just ate them plain, savoring the mix of meat, spice, and nostalgia. You could find recipes for these in community cookbooks with titles like Outdoor Favorites or Cold Table Classics. The macaroni beef ring was more than just a recipe, it was a showpiece. You took cooked elbow macaroni and ground beef, mixed it with eggs and tomato sauce, and pressed the whole thing into a ring mold. After it baked and set, you flipped it onto a serving plate, and there it stood, a golden brown pasta wreath. But the real drama came next. The center of the ring was filled with creamed peas, buttered corn, or even leftover stew if that is what you had. It was the kind of dinner that turned heads at church potlucks or family dinners. Kids would laugh, adults would smile politely, and everyone would eat it anyway because it was surprisingly good. The pasta held together just enough to slice, and the beef gave it weight and flavor. Sometimes there was cheese mixed in, sometimes it was just seasoned with onion powder and salt. Either way, it was a clever use of pantry staples and leftover meat. Savory ground beef Jell-O mold sounds like a joke now, but back then, it was an actual dish you could find in cookbooks across the country. Picture this: ground beef cooked with celery and onions, mixed with tomato or beef-flavored gelatin, and poured into a mold to chill. It came out looking like a jelly-covered meatloaf, and yes, people served it with pride. The gelatin acted as a binder and preservative, letting the dish be prepared ahead of time and stored without refrigeration for longer than usual. It was a wartime or emergency pantry trick that somehow found its way into mainstream cooking in the 1960s. Housewives would slice it into wedges and serve it with saltines or a dollop of mayonnaise, believing it was elegant. It was not, but it was practical. Gelatin was cheap and available, and this dish used only one pan and required no baking. Whether it was a result of rationing, cold buffets, or sheer culinary curiosity, it definitely left an impression. Hungarian hamburger bake brought a little old-world flair to the weeknight dinner table. This casserole took seasoned ground beef and paired it with wide egg noodles, paprika, sour cream, and cheese. You would layer everything into a baking dish, then bake it until the noodles were tender and the sauce was bubbling and golden on top. It was creamy, smoky, and deeply satisfying. The paprika added warmth without being too spicy, and the sour cream gave it that signature tangy richness. It was not exactly authentic Hungarian cuisine, but it borrowed enough to make you feel like you were eating something a little exotic. The recipe was especially popular in Midwestern kitchens, where Eastern European immigrant traditions were still alive and well. It was the kind of dish that made you feel cultured without straying too far from your comfort zone. Most of the ingredients came from cans, boxes, or the fridge, nothing fancy or hard to find, and that was the whole point. Sweet sour ground beef with pineapple was not subtle, but that is what made it shine. It was a stovetop dish you cooked in one big skillet. Ground beef browned with onions, then simmered in a mixture of pineapple chunks, vinegar, ketchup, and brown sugar. It smelled like takeout, it tasted like a tropical potluck, and it felt like a vacation, even when dinner was just in your tiny kitchen with the window cracked open. The sweetness from the pineapple and sugar mixed with the tang of vinegar to give the beef a punchy, bold flavor that clung to every grain of rice. This was the kind of dish that made kids ask for seconds, even if they did not love onions or peppers. You could find it in cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s, usually in a section called International Flair or Creative Ground Beef Dinners. It was experimental, but not in a bad way. This dish was about making something exciting with what you had. Canned pineapple, cheap beef, sugar from the pantry. That was it. Yet somehow it came together like magic. Dishes like this reminded people that food could be fun, even when times were not. Cabbage and beef layer bake was what happened when stuffed cabbage rolls felt like too much effort. Instead of rolling individual leaves, you just chopped the cabbage, browned the beef, and layered everything like a lazy lasagna. Then you poured over tomato sauce and baked it until the whole thing melted into itself. It was tangy, savory, and just the right amount of messy. The breadcrumbs on top gave it crunch, while the cabbage softened underneath like a blanket. This was old country cooking, without the fuss. You could stretch 1 pound of ground beef with half a head of cabbage and still feed 6 people. No special tools, no exotic spices, just tomato, meat, cabbage, and thyme. This bake was especially popular in towns with strong Polish or Russian immigrant roots. It showed up at potlucks, family gatherings, and Tuesday night dinners that needed to be warm and reliable. Sometimes it had rice mixed in, sometimes it had cheese. Either way, it filled the house with a smell that felt like home. You did not need to plate it pretty, just scoop it, serve it, and eat. Mexican haystack dinner was more of an event than a recipe. It started with a scoop of ground beef cooked in taco seasoning, then layered like a build-your-own buffet. Over a bed of white rice, or crushed corn chips if you had them, you added beef, shredded lettuce, canned olives, chopped tomatoes, grated cheese, and maybe a spoonful of salsa. The result was a towering, crunchy, colorful plate of dinner that let everyone at the table get exactly what they wanted. This dish became popular in the 1970s when families were busy, budgets were tight, and mealtime needed to be both fast and fun. It was a little Tex-Mex, a little potluck, and a whole lot of pantry smarts. You could make the beef ahead of time and let everyone serve themselves. It was casual, flavorful, and endlessly customizable. Even picky eaters got on board. It became a staple in school lunches, church dinners, and Friday night meals that needed zero cleanup. There was no baking, no timing, and no judgment. Just a pile of food that somehow worked together every single time. Haystacks were creative chaos on a plate, and we loved them for it. Ground beef and peanut butter stew sounds like a dare, but it was actually a smart Depression-era solution that made a quiet return during the 1960s. You browned ground beef with onions, added canned tomatoes, and stirred in a big spoonful of peanut butter. That was it. Somehow, it worked. The peanut butter melted into the stew, giving it a nutty richness and silky texture that made it taste like something much fancier. You could serve it over rice or eat it with bread. Either way, it was filling, affordable, and shockingly good. It came from the tradition of using pantry staples to bulk up basic meals, especially when meat was scarce. Peanut butter added protein, calories, and a hint of sweetness that made the tomato stew feel like something more. Some recipes added beans or chili powder, others kept it simple. This stew was rarely written in official cookbooks. It was passed down through word of mouth or scribbled in the back pages of community newsletters. But for those who remembered it, it was unforgettable. It was the kind of recipe that taught you how to be bold, even in a tiny kitchen. Beef and barley bake was what happened when you wanted stew without the soup. You took ground beef, cooked it with onions, carrots, and sometimes celery, then stirred in pearl barley and baked the whole thing until thick, golden, and aromatic. It was a dish that felt old, like something from your grandmother's farmhouse kitchen. And maybe it was. Barley has been around longer than most grains, and during the 1960s and 1970s, it was one of those ingredients that made a quiet comeback thanks to its price and nutrition. This bake was earthy and dense, like a cross between stuffing and pot roast. You could season it with thyme or just keep it simple. It filled the house with the smell of comfort. It kept you full for hours, and it made even the cheapest cut of beef stretch a little farther. Sometimes you added a splash of tomato juice, sometimes just a pat of butter on top. It was a blank canvas, but a dependable one. You could make it ahead of time, freeze it, and reheat it without losing an ounce of flavor. It may not win beauty contests, but beef and barley bake always won dinner. Hamburger eggplant casserole was a post-war invention that came straight out of backyard gardens and budget-conscious kitchens. People grew eggplant because it was hearty, easy to harvest, and filled out a meal when meat was in short supply. The dish started with sliced, salted eggplant that was briefly fried or baked, then layered with cooked ground beef, tomato sauce, and breadcrumbs. Sometimes there was cheese, sometimes not. It all depended on what you had. The flavors were simple but filling: rich tomato, soft eggplant, and the unmistakable heartiness of seasoned ground beef. You baked it until it bubbled and browned on top, and by the time it hit the table, it looked like a home-cooked lasagna without any of the fuss. This was food you made when you had too many eggplants and not enough time. It was healthy by accident and thrifty by design. You could serve it as a main course or stretch it with a side of white rice. Either way, it felt like a proper meal. Hamburger eggplant casserole may not have survived the decades in style, but it never failed where it counted: in taste, texture, and the comfort of something hot at the end of the day. Beefy rice-stuffed peppers were one of the more colorful dishes to come out of budget cooking. Bright bell peppers were hollowed out and filled with a mixture of cooked white rice, browned ground beef, diced onions, and canned tomato sauce. Everything got packed tight and placed upright in a baking dish, then simmered slowly in tomato broth until the peppers turned soft and sweet. It was a one-pan miracle that looked fancier than it actually was. Before wild rice and quinoa became household staples, plain white rice was the backbone of most dinner tables. It made the meat stretch farther and absorbed all the flavor. These stuffed peppers were part comfort, part presentation, and part good housekeeping. They made use of odds and ends from the fridge and felt like something you could serve to guests or just eat cold the next day. Sometimes they were topped with breadcrumbs or cheese. Sometimes they were plain. Either way, they filled the plate and the belly. You might not find them often now, but there was a time when they were everywhere. From potlucks to picnics, from lunch boxes to leftover nights, they were flavorful, practical, and proud of being a little bit extra. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf sounds like something out of a box, and it kind of was. This dinner came from a time when boxed pasta meals and processed cheese were part of every pantry, and ground beef was the weekly star. You would cook macaroni, mix it with browned beef and a block of soft cheese, then pack the whole thing into a greased loaf pan. After baking, you sliced it like meatloaf. What came out looked strange, but tasted like a cross between a diner burger and weeknight casserole. It held its shape well enough to pack in a lunchbox or reheat in a skillet with a little butter. Some families added ketchup or mustard to the mix, giving it an even more literal burger flavor. Others tossed in pickles or onions for texture. It was easy, filling, and did not require much more than a pot, a pan, and a little patience. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf was one of those meals that tasted better than it had any right to. It was not elegant, it was not even normal, but in the era of efficiency and post-war pride, it was exactly what a busy household needed. A whole loaf of dinner made to slice and share. Tamale pie with cornmeal crust was the Southwest's answer to a casserole, and it had attitude. The bottom was a savory mix of ground beef, onions, garlic, and chili powder, often with canned tomatoes or beans tossed in for volume. That got spooned into a deep dish. Then came the real star, a thick layer of cheesy cornmeal batter, sometimes spiked with jalapenos or creamed corn, poured over the top and baked until golden. When it came out of the oven, the cornmeal topping had puffed slightly, absorbing just enough of the sauce below to stay moist but never soggy. It smelled like campfire nights and school lunch lines. Tamale pie was bold, spicy, and comforting all at once. It let home cooks experiment with heat and seasoning, especially when taco kits were still new and exciting. You did not need to know how to make tamales to enjoy the flavor. Just beef, cornmeal, and some courage. The recipe showed up in Western and Southwestern cookbooks and made its way across the country in the back pockets of families looking for something different. It was not traditional, but it did not need to be. Tamale pie was its own thing, and that was more than enough. Budget-baked spaghetti with ground beef and ketchup was not trying to fool anyone. It just wanted to get the job done. Instead of a long-simmered marinara or fancy herbs, this casserole used ketchup as the main sauce. You would brown your ground beef with onions, cook some spaghetti, and mix it all together with a generous squirt, or several, of ketchup. Some families added a splash of milk or canned soup to stretch the mix and make it creamy. Then it went into the oven with a handful of processed cheese or shredded cheddar sprinkled on top. The end result? Tangy, gooey, and undeniably comforting. It might not have won any awards, but it definitely cleared plates. It was especially popular in homes where kids were picky eaters and ketchup was already the king of the dinner table. You could make a big tray for almost nothing and still have enough left for lunch. For many families, this was the real weeknight special. It had the flavor of a fast food burger and the filling power of pasta. Cheap, cheerful, and reliable. Sometimes that is all dinner needs to be. Hamburger gravy on cornbread was a southern staple you rarely see anymore, but it never stopped being smart. You browned ground beef with onions and seasoned it. Salt, pepper, maybe garlic powder if it was handy, then added a bit of flour and milk to make a creamy gravy. Instead of pouring it over biscuits, you served it over a warm slice of cornbread. The result was hearty and slightly sweet, something that stuck to your ribs. In Appalachian regions, this was weekday fare. It used pantry ingredients, filled a plate fast, and tasted like home. Sometimes the cornbread came from a cast-iron skillet, other times from a mix. No one judged. The creaminess, the crumbly texture, the beef salt, and the corn's sweetness made it work. It was cheap, fast, and made you feel cared for. Not fancy, not modern, but still just right. Hot dog and ground beef skillet was not just a kid-friendly meal. It was dinner in a pinch. You sliced a few hot dogs, browned them with ground beef and chopped onions, then stirred in a can of tomatoes. Maybe some macaroni if you were feeling ambitious. Let it simmer until the sauce thickened. Kids loved the hot dogs. Adults liked that it filled everyone up. Some called it Cowboy skillet. Others called it Tuesday. Either way, it stretched two meats into a full meal. No need for sides. Just a fork, a plate, and a few quiet minutes where everyone actually ate. These kinds of dishes showed up in older cookbooks, especially the kind you got free with a cereal box. They were not about impressing anyone, just making do. Beef and apple casserole sounds strange until you try it. It mixed brown beef with tart apples and onions, then baked it all in a mild broth or tomato sauce. The apples softened, turned sweet, and played off the savory beef in a way that felt surprising and familiar. It was not a dessert, not quite a stew. Somewhere in between, like pork chops and applesauce, but humbler. Some versions had breadcrumbs or mashed potatoes on top. Others stayed plain, served with toast. It was one of those oddball casserole ideas that only made sense in the 1960s. And many people made it again. The apples deepened the beef, the onions tied it all together. Sweet, savory, soft, and strange, but it worked. And for the people who made it back then, the taste never really left. Creamed beef in a potato nest was a clever way to make scraps feel like a feast. You would form mashed potatoes into small bowl-shaped mounds, then bake them until the edges crisped and the inside stayed fluffy. Meanwhile, you browned ground beef with onion, made a quick white sauce, and stirred it into a creamy mixture. Then you filled each nest with that savory beef and brought it to the table like it came from a fancy kitchen. It looked upscale, but it was pure practicality. You were using leftover mashed potatoes. You were stretching half a pound of beef with cream, and you were feeding 4 people with something that looked special. It caught on during the 1940s and lasted through the 1960s, mostly in frugal homes and wartime kitchens. Sometimes peas or mushrooms made it into the mix, sometimes shredded cheese on top. No matter the variation, it always felt like a small victory, a little effort, a little flair, and everyone got their own portion. Beef and tomato aspic with vegetables was once considered elegant. Seriously. You started with unflavored gelatin, added beef broth or tomato juice, and poured it over cooked beef, celery, peas, and carrots. Then it chilled in the fridge until firm. Served cold and shaped in a decorative mold, this jiggly dish became the centerpiece of many retro dinner parties. It was savory Jell-O, made not for sweetness, but for structure. The gelatin gave it shine. The beef gave it weight. The vegetables gave it texture. And the result was something you either liked or quietly skipped. Aspic ruled mid-century American cookbooks, especially for hosts wanting to impress. It was low-fat, high-protein, and oddly artistic. You would slice it thin and serve it with lemon or a dab of mayo. Today, it feels outdated. But for a generation raised on molded salads and chilled entrees, beef and tomato aspic was proof that even simple ingredients could be dressed up to impress. Beef macaroni loaf was what happened when mid-century homemakers got bored of plain old meatloaf and decided to shake things up, just a little. At first glance, it looked like the usual mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasoning. But inside, hiding like a delicious surprise, was elbow macaroni, cooked just shy of tender and folded right into the mix. Some versions even swapped out breadcrumbs entirely and used the pasta as the binder. Then came the tomato soup, poured in for moisture, color, and that unmistakable tangy sweet kick that Campbell's fans know all too well. The result was dense, hearty, and oddly elegant, like meatloaf had finally grown up and gotten a little flair. And because macaroni stretched the meat further, it was perfect for feeding bigger families on a budget. But for folks who wanted a more southern touch, the next dish took cornbread to places it had never gone before. Butter. Next on our list, we're going to be dealing with beef and grape casserole, which is an example of mid-century American cooking really leaving no stone unturned. It was a combination of flavors that was pretty unexpected. Most people think that this dish came out around the 1940s to the 1960s, and that makes sense. Fruit-based experimentation with your typical average Sunday meals was a lot more common. What was interesting was the influences for this dish. Swedish meatballs with lingonberries was another thing that was growing really popular as a recipe for home cooks, and a lot of Americans tried to come up with their own spin-offs of recipes like this. Typically, it had ground or cubed beef, and this was browned with onions. Then it would be combined with grape jelly or entire grapes, and a sauce would be made for the broth. Tomato paste or Worcestershire sauce would also go in this broth, and some versions also used canned mushroom soup and sour cream to help create a more velvety texture. While the dish was definitely really ambitious and set out to accomplish a lot of bold, difficult-to-work-with flavors, it ended up not really lasting past the 60s. It seems like that one decade was an isolated incident as far as casseroles were considered. Still, is this something you would like to try? Or do you like your grapes on a separate plate from your meat? Beef and cabbage skillet was not flashy, but it was reliable, and back in the post-war days, that counted for a lot. This dish came from the same logic that made Victory Garden's bloom and ration stamps necessary. Make the most of what you have. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and available year-round. Ground beef, when you could get it, was used sparingly. So together, they made a meal that could stretch across a week if needed. The process was simple. Brown the beef, toss in shredded or chopped cabbage, season with whatever you had, salt, pepper, vinegar, maybe a splash of soy sauce or tomato paste if you were lucky. The cabbage softened into ribbons, soaking up every bit of beefy flavor while adding its own earthy goodness. You ate it straight from the skillet, hot and steaming, with maybe a hunk of bread on the side. It was survival food that did not taste like sacrifice. And if that sounds hearty enough, just wait until we take this same idea to the great outdoors with foil, fire, and a little campfire nostalgia. Now, another dish that originated from Europe, stuffed kohlrabi. This traditional Hungarian dish features bulbs of kohlrabi stuffed with a flavorful pork and rice filling and served alongside a kohlrabi soup made with leftover scraps and greens. I know it doesn't sound very appealing, but if you're adventurous, it's worth a shot. But what is kohlrabi? Popular in Northern and Eastern Europe, kohlrabi is sometimes called a German turnip. Kohlrabi may look like an alien creature, but if you've never tried it, you're in for a treat. It has a texture similar to broccoli, but it's sweeter and not quite as smelly. Stuffed kohlrabi is a very traditional Hungarian dish, but there's no one single way to make it. Much like Italians and their marinara, every family will have their own different version of it, with different meats. Some feature beef instead of pork, or a mix of the two, as well as many different stuffings and seasonings. But this one is particularly unique in that it uses all vegetables, including greens. It makes its own side dish by pureeing the greens and leftover pulp from the hollowed-out bulbs into a gorgeously green, flavorful soup. Brilliant, right? Imagine a cake recipe that makes its own frosting or something. That would be sick, am I right? Or am I right? Kohlrabi has a mild, slightly sweet flavor, kind of like a cross between a cabbage and a turnip. Once stuffed, these little guys were baked until tender, with the beefy filling bubbling away inside. If your grandma was making kohlrabi, just know that she was way ahead of her time, since it can perfectly fit into today's low-carb keto lifestyle. Ground beef fondue balls were the kind of appetizer that made cocktail parties in the 1950s and 1960s feel just a little more exciting. Long before charcuterie boards and sliders took over the scene, these little beef bites ruled the hors d'oeuvre table. The base was simple: seasoned ground beef mixed with cooked rice or shredded cheese, rolled into balls, and sometimes even wrapped around a cube of cheddar. Then came the fun part. You either baked them until crispy or fried them golden brown, and served them with a side of bubbling fondue. Cheese, tomato, or mustard-based dips were all fair game. They were easy to make ahead, easy to freeze, and easy to eat, which made them perfect for house parties, church socials, and anything that required a plate of finger food with a little flair. They may have started as a budget-friendly snack, but they were anything but boring. And if your idea of fun is a skillet full of beef, rice, and Tex-Mex spices, then the next recipe is a spicy slice of vintage perfection. No stories. Don't confuse regular old boring meatloaf with this special Dutch oven meatloaf with crackers. No, don't get your wires crossed. It's definitely different. Back in the day, Grandma really knew how to jazz things up and make this classic into something unexpected, just by adding some crackers. When crackers are added to the mix, they become like little sponges full of flavor, absorbing juices and adding to the texture of the dish. But this still doesn't really make it that different from the regular meatloaf. So where does the difference lie? Well, it lies in the Dutch oven baking. This oven, or pot as some might say, locks in flavor and moisture like nothing you've ever seen before. The result? A tender, savory meatloaf with a perfectly crisp outer layer. And Grandma knew how to serve it right, with a thick layer of ketchup glaze on top. Because sometimes, more is more. Plus, when you add a side of mashed potatoes, it'll be like you're biting into nostalgia. Back in the Great Depression, Meatloaf was a go-to because it stretched a small amount of beef into a meal for the whole family. And crackers were cheaper than breadcrumbs, and we all know Grandma knows how to save some bucks. Campfire foil packets were 1 part meal and 1 part memory. If you ever went to a summer scout camp or had a backyard cookout in the 1960s or 1970s, chances are you have made one of these. It started with a square of foil and a sense of adventure. You piled on raw ground beef, thin sliced potatoes, carrot coins, and slivers of onion. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some garlic powder or ketchup if you were living fancy. Then you folded it all up, sealed it tight, and tossed it into the coals, or the oven if you were indoors. What came out 20 or 30 minutes later was something far greater than the sum of its parts. Some families added Worcestershire sauce or a pat of butter before sealing it. Others just kept it simple. But either way, it was delicious. It was also fun. There was something magical about unwrapping your own little packet and digging in with a fork. But if you wanted your beef with a bit more spice and southern flair, the next dish brought jambalaya right into casserole territory. By the 70s, Tournedos Rossini had made its own name in steakhouse culture, and it was one that no one would be forgetting anytime soon. All kinds of decadent steak dishes went and came throughout the history of America's culinary phases, but this one was something that was always popular among old money. It wasn't exactly something that I would say was as popular as Chateaubriand, but it was definitely something that was a really well-regarded meal among people who were fine dining professionals. It was something that was basically known for being benign as over the top. It was something that had grand as its middle name, and it was even named after a famous Italian composer from the 19th century, Gioacchino Rossini. It was something that screamed, "I'm rich," to everyone that eyed your waiter as they came to serve you. It combined all kinds of rare ingredients too. You had filet mignon, foie gras, Madeira, and wine, which were all really luxury imports. French cuisine was something that was considered the absolute peak of culinary sophistication, and Tournedos Rossini was one of the most over-the-top things you could get for yourself. As far as pricing went, each cruise ship and luxury hotel had their own price ranges, but you could expect to pay anywhere between $60 to $100 back then for an entire course, which is definitely a lot. Old-school goulash, or as some knew it, American chop suey, was the dish that proved ground beef and elbow macaroni were soulmates. This one-pot wonder became a fixture on stovetops from Maine to Missouri. It started with browned beef, onions, and garlic, all bubbling away in a pot. Then came the crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce, which turned the mix into a deep red stew. Toss in a few handfuls of cooked macaroni, and suddenly you had dinner for 6, and maybe lunch tomorrow. What made goulash so special was not just the taste, though that was plenty satisfying. It was the simplicity. It was comfort food with no rules, and that made it a favorite in kitchens where imagination mattered more than a well-stocked pantry. Goulash was the dish that filled plates and hearts at the same time. But if you think that was creative, wait until you see what happened when someone took a bag of corn chips and turned it into dinner. If you ever wanted to try some saddle of venison, then you could go to any number of steakhouses and fine dining continental restaurants in many states. Some of these, like Le Pavillon and Maison Robert, made a name for themselves as being one of the best places to go to if you wanted French food done right. Others, like La Caravelle and the 21 Club, were easily some of the best places to go for if what you were looking for was a very well-made steak. Either way, it was something you would find only where the cats with the biggest piles of gold would come to play. You know, at Maison Robert, it wasn't just damn good venison they were selling. You even got wild boar there. Basically, this dish was meant for all things special and memorable, and if you really wanted to go all out either for yourself or someone else, then you could definitely just do this because it was probably the safest choice amongst all of them. The venison saddle was really something that elevated venison and what it could do for you, as well as opening people's minds to more venison-based dishes. Moving on to something that is American-made, Salisbury steak, seasoned ground beef patties, pan-seared to perfection, and then smothered in a rich onion-loaded gravy. What's not to like? I bet most of you haven't heard the backstory of Salisbury steak, so let me educate you. It is best known as a staple of TV dinners and bargain buffets. The Salisbury steak actually has its beginnings as a proposed cure for digestive illness during the Civil War. If you didn't know, digestive illnesses killed more soldiers during the Civil War than combat did, and a diet rich in beefsteak and coffee was one suggested cure. The inventor of the Salisbury steak, Dr. James Henry Salisbury, was an early pioneer of germ theory and of diet being a factor in health. While some of his ideas may be outdated today, his affection for beefsteak and his promotion of its positive effect on health have persisted. While patties of ground beef are common fare, the Salisbury steak was cemented in the American lexicon during World War I. In many English-speaking countries, there was a movement to limit the use of German-sounding words, so the Army served Salisbury steak rather than Hamburg steak and Liberty sandwiches instead of hamburgers. Sure, it may not be the health trend it once was, but let's be honest, it's a comfort food icon for a reason. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Pineapple beef bake was a casserole that felt like a luau in your oven. It came straight out of the 1960s, when tiki culture had Americans decking out their living rooms with bamboo furniture and sipping drinks with paper umbrellas. In that same spirit, someone decided to toss ground beef into the mix, and the result was surprisingly delicious. You would brown the beef, stir in soy sauce, onions, and bell peppers, then layer it into a casserole dish with pineapple chunks, usually canned, syrup, and all. The pineapple gave it a tropical tang that cut through the richness of the beef, while the soy sauce and aromatics grounded it in something warm and familiar. It was quirky, no doubt, but it had personality. It stood out on a table full of casseroles, and for a while, it was the kind of dish that brought smiles, and maybe a hula dance or two. But if you think pineapple was a bold move, wait until ground beef went from casserole filler to party centerpiece. Hamburger upside-down pie is really one that's for people who like to experiment with their food. It has a lot of practical thought put into it, but somebody clearly had a lot of fun making this. You take ground beef, and then you take the concept of a baked pie, and what do you get when you mix those two together? A layer of seasoned ground beef packed beautifully at the bottom of a baking dish, laden with onions, tomato sauce, biscuit crumbs, and a cornbread topping. This pie would be baked and then flipped upside down so the bottom layer of beef was the first thing you had, and it was filling enough to feed your entire family and then some. This dish was a part of resourceful home cooking, and it makes me agree with something I saw earlier. It said that being bored is actually good for you because it brings out your creativity. I think that people had so little to work with in these times that they were for once thinking genuinely outside of the box, and sometimes that led to some actual eureka moments, and other times it was fun, little interactive dishes like this. While it wasn't remembered much, it was still a pretty convenient meal that you could even freeze for later if you weren't feeling like eating it all in one go. Understandably, because this is a behemoth to take down on your own. If you're a fan of retro cooking, though, this is a good place to start. Those interesting casseroles don't just end with peanut. The 1970s saw the rise and dominance of the timeless lobster thermidor, a dish that still has all the best restaurants in the world using it to prove they're worth every little best of your money. It has a long history of being a status symbol, one that represents all kinds of indulgence and wealth, from fancy night outs that you saved up for to the finest meals on cruise liners. You might not know, though, that lobster thermidor actually has a lot of French history to it, The dish used to be a luxury dining item since well before it ever made a name for itself in America. After the 50s, people had begun to explore continental dining experiences more, and this was particularly common amongst the upper middle class. They loved themselves a good thermidor, if nothing else. Now, I know you all think lobsters can be a bit of a chore to eat sometimes, but they're 10 times more of a headache to make too, and even more expensive to get. You had to employ some real skilled chefs to make something out of a good Maine lobster, so only the rich could afford the outrageous prices some menus would charge. In the 70s, lobster thermidor was something you would see in gourmet prix-fixe menus, which would often cost more than $80 per couple. To start off, the classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Sloppy Joe pie was what happened when someone decided that sloppy joes deserved a throne. You started with the classic filling, ground beef, tomato sauce or ketchup, a hint of mustard or Worcestershire if you were feeling adventurous, all simmered until it thickened into that perfect sweet, savory sloppy joe consistency. But instead of sandwiching it in a soft bun, you would pour it into a casserole dish and crown it with a golden biscuit crust. Sometimes it was homemade dough, sometimes it was straight from a can, but it always rose into a fluffy, buttery topping that made the whole dish feel complete. Some versions used cornbread instead, which gave it a southern twist with just the right amount of sweetness. And even though it was born in a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, Sloppy Joe pie had enough personality to still turn heads today. But if you thought ground beef had done it all, just wait until you meet the recipe that turned soda pop into secret sauce. Beef and biscuit ring was the edible version of a kitchen handshake. Simple ingredients coming together in a way that felt a little bit fancy. This one was big in the 1950s and 1960s, the kind of dish you made when company was coming over and you wanted something pretty on the table. You would brown up a skillet of ground beef with onions, season it well, and stir in tomato sauce or Worcestershire for a saucy bite. Then came the biscuits, either homemade or straight from a can, no judgment here. You arranged them in a circle on a baking sheet or dish, spooned the beef mixture into the center, and baked until the biscuits puffed up golden and the beef was bubbling away like it had somewhere to be. It was a hit at parties and potlucks alike, and if there was cheese melted on top, forget about it. Plates were wiped clean. But if you really wanted to feel like you were dining at a steakhouse on a hamburger budget, the next dish took things up a notch. I know some of you aren't fond of soupy dishes, but please hear me out. Beef paprikash. It sounds complicated to make, but I know your grandma, just like mine, made it without batting an eye. Imagine tender beef simmered in a rich paprika-infused sauce, bursting with smoky and spicy flavors. This dish is like goulash's cousin, wouldn't you say? Beef paprikash is a traditional Hungarian dish where it was a hit in kitchens where spices were basically like family heirlooms. But, contrary to popular beliefs here in the United States, paprikash is traditionally made without beef or macaroni noodles. Shocking, right? Its origins date back to the 9th century Magyar shepherds as a simple meat and onion stew prepared in heavy iron kettles known as bograks. In the 15th century, invading Ottoman Turks introduced a new spice to Hungary, paprika. While the rest of Europe remained lukewarm towards this red chili pepper from the New World, Hungary embraced it, and paprika has since become a defining element of Hungarian cuisine. Paprikash is kind of in between a soup and a stew. Unlike some stews, paprikash is not overly packed full of beef and vegetables. It is a little more brothy. But through the cooking process, the broth becomes a little thicker and very rich in flavor. And here's another fun fact for you. Paprika is actually made from dried bell peppers and has been around since the 16th century. And if you thought paprika was just for sprinkling on deviled eggs, think again. Rag mop casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one, a dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. So, people used to think the best way to enjoy supper was to get some hash browns from a local diner. But if your grandpa made the right choices in life and as a result you now sip on caviar for fun, you would be more interested in something like terrine de foie gras. This was something that was a big part of gourmand culture all throughout the early 20th century, and it was something that saw a spike in popularity after the war had ended. French haute cuisine was the apex predator in the fine dining restaurant scene, especially in big boy cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The dish itself was definitely one of the hallmark recipes of its time, being nothing less than absolute extravagance. It was something you'd associate with high society, with people who had big gates and the latest Porsche or something. Even food connoisseurs were amazed at how well the dish had fit into the American palate, despite how it was not something that you would typically see in an American menu at all, but that just goes to show how much times changed right after the wars had ended. Ah, the classic beef and potato casserole. Reminds me of a time when 40-step recipes from Instagram didn't exist, and it was all about simplicity and comfort. The layers of browned ground beef, golden potatoes, and a creamy sauce could warm even the coldest hearts. Topped with a generous amount of cheese, of course, because when you're at grandma's, more cheese equals more love. Why was this dish suddenly forgotten? Maybe it's because all of the new recipes call for superfoods and gluten-free alternatives, which this casserole is definitely not. It's a classic, old-school ground beef dish. The magic of beef and potato casserole lies in its simplicity. It's basically just a few staple ingredients thrown together and baked until bubbly. No fuss. It's hearty and delicious. Plus, who doesn't love a meal where everything is combined into one pan? Less cleanup means more time in front of the TV watching your favorite 80s sitcom. Seconds are almost always guaranteed, so you could also say that this dish is perfect for meal stretches and it's budget-friendly. Mock turtle soup is something that I'm dead sure you would not have seen coming. See, it's something that came out of 18th century England as a substitute for real turtle soup, which, by the way, was insanely popular in these times. People used to actually consider it something of a delicacy. During the Georgian and Victorian eras, green turtle soup would have sea turtles in it, and it was an incredibly prized dish popular among the local aristocracy. Before you crack a nice little cutting-edge joke about how British cuisine is the strangest thing on the planet, this was also popular in American high society, and it's something that got us through the Depression. That's right. Mock turtle soup was something that people would make as much as they could when real turtles weren't around or were too expensive. Now, real turtle meat is known for having an incredibly rich and gelatinous broth. The key to mock turtle soup was just to start with the head of a calf or an oxtail, boil it down with a blend of vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions and a spice rub, and slow cooking it. Next, once all the natural collagen was extracted, people would usually add in wine or sherry or Madeira, and this was really common in traditional turtle soup. It replicates the texture of the actual turtle meat, and cooks would try very hard to get that down right. It's one of the most interesting pieces of mock food culture we have, and it shows how good people got at imitating different kinds of foods without the core ingredients. Coca-Cola beef skillet might sound like something dreamed up at a county fair food stand, but back in the 1960s, it was a weeknight marvel. You took a skillet, browned up a pound of ground beef with onions, added a healthy squeeze of ketchup, and then, here's the twist, poured in a splash of Coca-Cola. That was the secret sauce. The soda added a surprising depth, a sticky sweetness that balanced the tang of the ketchup and rounded out the beefy base. It cooked down into something thick and glossy, like a glaze that made every bite feel more indulgent than it had any right to be. Kids went wild for it, and parents loved that it took maybe 15 minutes to get on the table. Coca-Cola beef skillet was the edible proof that the best meals often come from a bit of whimsy and whatever is sitting in the fridge door. And if pasta was your pantry fallback, then the next recipe might just be your new meatloaf obsession. If one of these dishes made you smile or scratch your head, tell us in the comments, tap like and subscribe for more comfort food you did not know you missed.